So in this presentation, we're going to be taking a look at what happens to African Americans in the um, post-Reconstruction era. And some of it actually is happening during Reconstruction era. So what will happen here is just this sentence, I think, is really the story of African Americans in terms of suffrage and also other rights as well. So this is how African Americans won, then lost, then won again the right to vote. So we all know, going through the course, about the way that the United States has expanded over time, that every time a new state came in, there was always this question about whether or not it was going to be coming in as a slave state or a free state. And this led to compromises like the Missouri Compromise and then also the Compromise of 1850. And then just before the Civil War, there is a case that finally settles the question as to whether or not the Constitution favors or is anti the idea of slavery, and the court decided, as read out by Justice Taney, that blacks were so far inferior that they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, and that basically repudiated whatever there was on the Missouri Compromise, because basically you have slavery everywhere. Every state has to respect the institution of slavery. They, of course, did not like that, and that led to the Civil War, which we have just gone through. And as a result of that, we get the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment rights. 13th, which was the idea that you can't have any slavery, and that the Congress is going to have the power to enforce that article. So that's important because it means that there's going to eventually be this shift where the Congress and the federal government are going to be far more powerful than the states and their own individual legislatures that had previously upheld black codes. So this was going to end slavery. And then as a result of that, there are organizations that are set up, like the Freedmen's Bureau, that was established for a short period of time, that aided the newly freed slaves to becoming a part of American society. And provided food, housing, education, healthcare, and in some cases united families with people that they had not seen for a very long time. And the other thing is that they had to they felt they had to come up with a method by which to take former slaves and make it possible for them to figure out the terms by which they're going to be employed. So basically, we'll talk about this in a moment. This problem still persists even after the Freedmen's Bureau, but at least with Freedmen's Bureau, if you were a freed slave, then you would have some place to go to when you had to negotiate the terms for renting out land, which often was done from your former masters to then work that land. So the Freedmen's Bureau was kind of an institution that would help with that. When that was gone, any kind of protection that they had when it came to that was gone. And we'll talk about the results, which was sharecropping, which is basically debt farming. They were constantly in debt. It ultimately became ineffective. 1866, it gets attacked by Southern whites for organizing blacks against their former masters, which we just talked about. So there's a lot of distaste for the Freedmen's Bureau by Southerners. And there was also a lack of military presence to actually enforce their authority. And there was a lot of paperwork that were involved. And by 1871, it is gone and is replaced by sharecropping. So this is a county by county map of sharecropping as it existed in the South. And you could see that it was fairly prevalent. So what is this? Sharecropping, or I guess like the more technical term, is a crop lien system. Lien just means a mortgage. So debt. And so basically what happens is people put a lien on their crop. So any future crop that they would have would then be used as a way to pay off the debt. So they put a lien on the crop. So what happens is the tenant farmer negotiated terms with some landowner to work the land. And often that landowner was their previous master. So there were not favorable terms. I mean, previously they worked for free. Now they're going to have to pay. They're going to have to pay them in some capacity. So what happens is they would negotiate the ability to work a piece of land that was owned by their former landowner, and then they would go and find they would do that by, and they have no money, so they would have to negotiate with their former landowner. So like the rent for that land would be about a quarter to a half of the tenant's farmer's future crop. So they say, hey, this piece of land, we're gonna keep, we're gonna work the land, and then when we're done, we're gonna give out this half or this quarter of the crop to you in the future. So that farmer then works the land, but along the way, they need other things more than the land. They need tools, and they need seed, and they need food, clothing, and then they need any kind of necessity. So they then negotiate terms to pay for those things that are the rest of the crop. So basically, what that means is that they're working the land, and they're saying to the person that's renting the land from, hey, we'll give you a quarter to a half of our future crop. This, let's say it's in this case a half. So when they're done, they turn over half their crop to the landowner, and then they pay the rest at the end of the season to the furnishing merchant. But often they owe more than they made in the crop in the end, and so we end up in a cycle of poverty. It's all sharecropping because you own a share of the land and then you work the land, but you don't ever really have the ability to pay off your debt. Here's just another way of kind of explaining what I talked about. The sharecropper receives the land and seed, and in exchange he promises the landowner half the crop. The sharecropper buys the food and clothing on credit from the landowner's store, and then the sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper gives the landowner crop to sell. Sharecropper gets half the earnings minus the debt for the year. And when settling up, the landowner says, hey, you owe more than what you earned. So then to pay off the debt, they promise more of their future crop for the following year. And they end up in a cycle of poverty and are never able to get out. So if you wonder, why is it that blacks living in the South don't just escape this system? It's because, think about it, you have cultural institutions that are where you live, and and most notably the church. So the American Methodist Church is there, the AME. And then beyond that, you have to deal with the fact that you need money to move. So it's not super easy. So sharecropping basically is often referred to as slavery by another name. Eventually, the Civil Rights Act, one of the first ones passed of Civil Rights Act of 1866, and what it does is it grants African Americans citizenship and granted them the same legal status as whites. The 14th Amendment codifies that citizenship into law, into the Constitution, and is actually the first time that the Constitution ever defines who is and who is not a citizen. And under that law, they also grant them equal protection under the law. The Reconstruction plans that get put out, civil authorities in the territories effectively create military supervision to make sure that the 13th and 14th Amendment rights are being upheld. They require that any new state that comes back into the Union must ratify these amendments. And then in March of 1867, Congress passes an act that authorizes the military to enroll eligible black voters and begin the process of constitution making. So they're going to register them to vote. But this creates these different military districts. And by the 15th Amendment kind of codifies previously what was written, where they, in 1867, authorized the voter registration of black people. It writes it in law in the Constitution that those people are guaranteed the right to vote. This is an interesting moment for women because women's rights organizations had long fought for and alongside of abolitionists. And in the end, they were hoping that they would also get their gender recognized in the 15th Amendment. And so what they realize is that it doesn't happen. They don't get their name in there. And that means that women start to realize that they need to fight for their own. And they change tactics. For a short time, for a notable but short time, black people are running for office and at every level up to the federal government. So this is the first Black Senate and House delegates. And they're like the first class that had ever happened and taken place. And you might ask yourself, well, we know at least by 1877, that Black people are unable to vote. So how could you have the 14th Amendments, the 15th Amendment, and not have the right to vote? And there's a lot of reasons that this takes place, but one of them is the result of the development of the KKK is one of the major elements of it, as a part of what they call the Invisible Empire. And they would go and try to enforce the unwritten laws of the South, which were that Black people were going to be segregated and denied the right to vote, even though it was constitutionally protected. Congress did not like this during the Reconstruction era. They created and passed what were called enforcement acts after people testified to how terrible it was, but they were very difficult to enforce. Basically, it's known as the KKK Act. It made the KKK illegal. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 follows the one from 66. It made it a crime for anyone to deny people equal protection under the law. It prohibited discrimination in jury selection, which was a big area by which Black people could be discriminated against. Having no Black people on juries meant that Black people can be easily convicted of crimes that they did not commit. But there were very little in terms of strong enforcement mechanisms. And they're actually, for almost nearly 100 years hence, there have not been any civil rights acts, and not until 90 years later, which is amazing. Almost 100 years go by. The 14th and 15th Amendment rights are still on the books, but the 14th Amendment is used more often in the Gilded Age and even just all the way up to the present to protect individual rights of businesses. So basically what happens is under old common law that we received from Great Britain, a way to protect a business from liability is to incorporate the business. And then by incorporation, you make it so that there isn't any one person who is held liable, but rather just the corporation itself. So if, let's say, someone goes, just small example, someone goes to McDonald's today and they trip on the carpet as they're entering in and then fracture their hip. If that were to take place, then McDonald's, the corporation, would get sued, but the actual people who own McDonald's would not. If you go to a dry cleaner and that dry cleaner is not incorporated and you trip and you fall, then the people that you would sue would be the owners of the dry cleaner. And you can go after them and all of their assets, depending on how their business is set up. If they incorporate, then they can protect themselves against liability. So for incorporation, that basically means that the corporate entity, the McDonald's, the Google, whatever company you want to come up with that has become incorporated, is a person for purposes of the law. So every time in the Gilded Age that the federal government or the state governments, and more in particular, tried to write law that would regulate that business to prevent it from forming a monopoly, the companies would argue that they are people and that their rights are being violated under the 14th and 15th Amendment rights. 14th, not 15th. They never, as far as I know, claimed they had the right to vote, but the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. So it more often protected businesses than it did Black people, which I think is the point of this era, that there's less and far less of a focus on protecting Black people's rights. There's greater focus on the economy. And so that's really the big difference here. The other thing to keep note of is the fact that the 14th Amendment, in as much as it protected Black people's rights, also kind of gets carved, all these exceptions get carved out over the years in terms of the court. So there are a whole slew of cases. So I'll give you some examples. The slaughterhouse cases, these are a group of cases, but basically they concluded that the states, not the national government, have authority over people's rights. So if states want to discriminate, they could, and the national government didn't have the authority over people's rights individually. In Bradwell versus Illinois, it said that women had the right to be denied to practice law because that was their traditional role in the home. In U.S. versus Reese et al., 1876, only states could decide if you could vote. States could deny people the right to vote for other things other than racial reasons. So, yes, you have the 15th Amendment right to vote. If you're a black person in particular, and you can't be denied the right to vote on race, color, creed, or ethnicity. However, you could be denied the right to vote because you lack education or you lack property. And so that means that you can have property restrictions like a poll tax of some kind people have to pay in order to vote, or you could deny the person the right to vote because they could not pass a civic test. Even though that effectively those types of things, those barriers to voting, were designed to deny black people from voting, it wasn't specifically racial, and so therefore was protected. Then United States versus Cruikshank, it says the 14th Amendment protected people against states denying your rights, not other individuals. So if I was a private pool club or a private golf club or a restaurant, I could deny you the right to come in because I'm not the state. I'm a private institution. So that's why you get segregation laws. And then Civil Rights Acts, cases rather, of 1883 takes a look at the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875 and concluded that Congress could not write law that protected blacks from discrimination from individuals. So some of those laws protected you from being denied certain rights from other individuals or corporations or companies and things like that. And the courts concluded that the Congress was writing law unconstitutionally. Then in comes the election of 1876, which you can read an entire book on. But suffice it to say that the election of 1876 is the death knell for military Reconstruction. And the brief history of this is that there was a showdown in Congress over who was going to win the presidency because there were election returns that came out of South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida that were in dispute. And what would have to happen next is that it would go to the House of Representatives to determine who the president was. Going into that, Hayes would have won the electoral vote as it stood then, at 185 to 184. The popular vote also, popular vote had a different result where Tilden would have won. He had 51% of the popular vote, but we know that the popular vote doesn't matter in presidential elections. But there were still 20 electoral votes that were in states that were in dispute. And so what happens is this election goes to the House because of that dispute, this tie that takes place. And ultimately, they decide that South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida are still states that have military Reconstruction. Remember before I said that there was these districts that were created that divided out the South, and that look at Florida, it still had troops that were in the South there. In Louisiana, there were still troops by the time of the election, and in South Carolina. So these were the last three states, and then Oregon also had disputed election results. But the number of votes that you would need to win the election could have easily been won if these three states were to agree to vote in a particular candidate. And so when it went to the House of Representatives, Hayes strikes a deal with the people in the South and says that if I win the election, I will pull the troops out of the South. And you no longer have military Reconstruction. And he does that. As a result, we get segregation and things like Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is a term that comes from a character from minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was a kind of like entertainment where sometimes black people, sometimes white people would put on blackface. So if you were black, you would also even put on grease paint. And it was basically like a idyllic way, an incorrect way of kind of showing how great life was on the plantation in the South. And one of the characters was called Jim Crow. He would be one of the people who would sing a song. And this was the song that he sang. Wheel about, turn around, do just so every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. So Jim Crow got, basically became the moniker for the segregation laws that were written that resulted in part because of the fact that the KKK was rising, even though the Congress tried to pass enforcement acts. The fact that there were all kinds of laws that were basically being, like, all of the 14th Amendment is kind of being carved out, all these exceptions in terms of the Supreme Court. And then eventually the president pulling the military out of the South. It led to the ability for the South to kind of have control over its own. And in a lot of ways, it was found to be legal at the time because the Supreme Court is saying, well, you can deny people the right to vote as long as it's not based on race. So we can do it. We can, institute all kinds of things to deny people the right to vote as long as we're not specifically targeting their race. So some barriers to voting that occurred after this period, tests of knowledge about the American government that were used to deny Black people the right to vote. These were called literacy tests, but some of them are so obvious that they are almost impossible to do. Like there aren't even like literacy tests; they're just impossible tasks for people to do. And this denied Black people the right to vote. There was also a poll tax that you would have to pay, so an actual fee that you have to pay in order to vote. And then to prevent white people from being caught up in this problem, so that, remember the court said that you can't deny it to a Black person, but you can say that it's bad education. So to make sure that white people still had this and they weren't violating the law, they created something called the Grandfather Clause, which just said, oh, well, if you were able to vote in the 1861 election, then you don't have to take the literacy test. But, in 1861, Black people were enslaved in the South. So effectively, it meant so that whites don't have to take it because they would be the only one that would be grandfathered as a result of all this. And the courts upheld it, all of this, as being constitutional. And the other element, of course, is the KKK. Between the 1880s and 1940s or so, there were an unprecedented number of people who were lynched, who even tried to go and vote and register to vote even. Over time, we eventually get rid of a lot of the worst parts of violations of voting rights. And I'm not going to go over them in depth because we'll talk about them as we go through. But that kind of brings you up to the 1880s in terms of suffrage.